The moment someone calls you a burden in your own home, you learn exactly how they see you. My name is Richard Bennett. I am 73 years old, and on Thanksgiving Day, seated at the dining table where my late wife and I hosted family dinners for nearly 40 years, my daughter-in-law said something that changed the way I looked at my family forever. The house was full that afternoon. The smell of roasted turkey drifted from the kitchen. Football played quietly on the television in the family room. Grandchildren laughed as they chased each other through the hallway. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way a Thanksgiving celebration should look. Warm, comfortable, familiar. I had spent 3 days preparing for that meal. Even at my age, I still enjoyed hosting. The house had always been the center of family gatherings. It was where birthdays happened, where Christmas mornings unfolded, where my wife Margaret hung stockings every December before cancer took her 8 years ago. Every room carried a memory. Every wall held part of our story. My son Michael arrived first with his wife Amanda and their children. Amanda walked through the front door carrying several casserole dishes while immediately commenting on things she thought should be changed around the house. New paint, different furniture, updated lighting. I smiled politely. It was not unusual anymore. Over the last 2 years, Amanda had developed a habit of talking about my home as though she already had a say in what happened to it. At first, I dismissed it as enthusiasm. Then it started feeling like something else. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed small things. Amanda rearranged serving trays without asking. She instructed people where to sit. She corrected me twice while I was telling stories to the grandchildren. None of it was serious on its own, but together, it created a strange feeling I could not quite explain. As dinner began, everyone gathered around the long oak table that had belonged to my parents before me. 20 years ago, I refinished it by hand in the garage. Margaret used to joke that I spent more time protecting that table than I did protecting myself. Looking around the room, I tried to focus on gratitude, family, health, another year together. Then the conversation shifted. One of my grandchildren asked if I planned to travel more in retirement. I laughed and said I was happy right where I was. "This house keeps me busy enough," I said. Before I could continue, Amanda smiled and took a sip of wine. "Well," she said casually, "eventually it might be easier if you stop trying to manage everything yourself." The room grew quieter. I chuckled politely. "I think I am doing all right so far." Amanda leaned back in her chair. "I am just saying there comes a point when people need to admit they are becoming a burden." The words seemed to echo through the room. Burden. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. I looked around the table. My grandson stared at his plate. My daughter looked uncomfortable. And Michael, my own son, said absolutely nothing. Amanda continued eating as though she had commented on the weather. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Something deeper. Disappointment. The kind that settles heavily after trust begins to crack. I slowly placed my fork on the table and took a sip of water. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then someone changed the subject and conversation resumed. But I barely heard another word for the rest of dinner. Because while everyone else moved on, I could not stop thinking about one question. How long had Amanda been seeing me as a burden without me realizing it? After dinner ended, the house slowly emptied. Children gathered coats from the hallway closet. Leftover containers disappeared into reusable bags. Cars pulled out of the driveway one by one until only a few vehicles remained beneath the porch light. I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing dishes while trying to convince myself Amanda's comment did not matter. People say careless things. Holidays create stress. Maybe I was making too much of it. That was the explanation I wanted to believe. Unfortunately, another image kept returning to my mind. Michael's face when Amanda called me a burden. He had not looked shocked. He had not looked angry. He had simply looked down at his plate. That silence bothered me more than the comment itself. By 9 o'clock, only Michael and Amanda remained. Their children were asleep upstairs in guest rooms. We often invited them to stay overnight after major holidays to avoid driving home late. Normally, I enjoyed having family under my roof. That evening felt different. I carried a box of decorations into the garage and spent several minutes organizing shelves simply to avoid thinking. When I finally returned toward the house, voices drifted from the family room. I was not trying to listen. In fact, I intended to walk straight past. Then I heard my name. Instinctively, I stopped. Amanda was speaking. "The house is too much for him now." Her voice sounded calm and confident. "You can see it." Michael replied quietly, making it difficult to hear every word. Amanda continued, "Honestly, once he finally admits it, things will be easier for everyone." I remained motionless in the hallway. A grandfather clock ticked softly nearby. "Amanda," Michael said, "it is still his house." She laughed lightly. Not a cruel laugh. A dismissive one. For now. Those two words settled heavily in the silence that followed. For now. I slowly stepped backward before either of them noticed I was there. A few moments later, I quietly went upstairs and closed my bedroom door. Sleep never came easily that night. Instead, I stared at the ceiling while memories moved through my mind. I thought about the day Margaret and I bought this property. We were newly married and had almost no money. The house needed repairs. The roof leaked. The kitchen cabinets were older than either of us. But we loved it immediately. Over the years, we rebuilt nearly every room together. I installed hardwood floors with my own hands. Margaret chose paint colors. We planted the maple tree in the backyard when Michael was 6 years old. Every improvement carried a story. Every corner of the house contained part of our life. The idea that someone could casually discuss what would happen after I was gone felt deeply unsettling. The following morning, I came downstairs early. Amanda was already sitting at the kitchen island drinking coffee. She smiled when she saw me. The same polite smile she always used. "Good morning, Richard." I returned the greeting and poured myself a cup. For a few minutes we discussed ordinary things. The weather, holiday traffic, the children. Then Amanda glanced around the kitchen and said something that immediately caught my attention. "You know, once some renovations happen, this place could really look amazing." Once some renovations happen. The phrase sounded strangely familiar, as if plans already existed somewhere beyond my knowledge. I smiled politely but said nothing. Yet as I watched her speak, a question formed in my mind. Had Amanda simply been rude at Thanksgiving? Or had she already started imagining a future where this house belonged to someone else? After Michael and Amanda left later that morning, the house felt unusually quiet. Normally, I enjoyed the silence after a holiday gathering. This time it felt different. The words I had overheard lingered in every room. For now, once he finally admits it. The phrases replayed in my mind while I washed dishes and packed leftovers into containers. By early afternoon, I found myself standing in the living room looking at a framed photograph of Margaret. It had been taken during our 25th wedding anniversary trip to Maine. She was smiling at something outside the camera's view. Looking at that picture always made me feel grounded. That day it also made me feel thoughtful. Margaret had an extraordinary ability to notice things before anyone else. More than once she warned me when someone was taking advantage of my generosity. Most of the time she was right. I found myself wondering what she would have said about Amanda. The answer came quickly. She would have told me to pay attention to actions instead of explanations. That advice stayed with me throughout the following week. Once I started paying attention, I began noticing things I had ignored before. Amanda called twice. Both conversations centered on the house. She asked whether I had considered replacing the kitchen cabinets. She mentioned converting the downstairs office into another bedroom. At one point, she casually suggested removing a wall between the dining room and family. Of the ideas were outrageous. What felt strange was the confidence behind them. She spoke as though these decisions were already hers to make. Then something happened that truly caught my attention. The following Saturday, my sister Sarah stopped by for coffee. During our conversation, she mentioned seeing Amanda at a local home improvement store several weeks earlier. She was looking at flooring samples, Sarah said. She told the salesman she was planning updates for the family house. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. The family house. Sarah nodded. That is exactly what she called it. The comment stayed with me long after Sarah left. That evening, curiosity finally overcame hesitation. I sat down at my desk and began reviewing old documents related to the property. Mortgage records, insurance papers, tax statements. Most had not been touched in years. Everything was organized in a filing cabinet Margaret insisted we maintain. As I sorted through folders, memories returned. Closing day, refinancing paperwork, home improvement permits. Decades of family history existed inside those files. Then I found myself studying something I had not looked at in a very long time. The original property documents. At first, I was simply being thorough. I wanted to remind myself exactly how everything was structured. The more I thought about Amanda's comments, the more I wanted clarity. Not because I feared losing the house, because I wanted to understand why she seemed so certain about its future. As evening settled outside, I continued reading. Every page reinforced the same fact. Margaret and I had built this life carefully. Nothing about ownership had ever been accidental. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was Michael. We exchanged a few minutes of small talk before he mentioned something that immediately captured my attention. Amanda has been really excited lately, he said. She keeps talking about what we might do with the property someday. Property. Not house. Not home. Property. I remained silent for a moment. Then I asked a simple question. What exactly does she think is going to happen someday? Michael hesitated. And in that hesitation, was far more to this story than I had realized. Michael's hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it told me more than any answer could have. What exactly does she think is going to happen someday? I repeated. On the other end of the phone, I heard him exhale slowly. Dad, I think she just means eventually everyone has to make plans. Plans. Another word that seemed harmless on the surface. Another word that suddenly carried far more weight than it should have. What kind of plans? I asked. Michael hesitated again. Things like renovations. Maybe expanding the kitchen. Maybe updating the backyard. I stared at the property documents spread across my desk. And Amanda talks about these things often? Sometimes, he admitted. She likes thinking ahead. After we ended the call, I remained seated for a long time. Outside, winter rain tapped softly against the windows. The house felt quiet, but my mind was anything but quiet. The more I replayed recent conversations, the more a pattern emerged. Amanda never spoke about possibilities. She spoke about future decisions as though they were already approved. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention. Amanda called twice. During one conversation, she mentioned a contractor she liked. During another, she described a flooring style that would work perfectly in the downstairs living room. Not might work. Would work. Each comment was small. Yet together they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. Then something happened that removed any remaining doubt. The following Saturday, Michael and Amanda stopped by unexpectedly with the children. I welcomed them inside. The grandchildren immediately ran upstairs toward the game room while the adults gathered in the kitchen. Everything felt normal at first. Coffee was poured. Conversation stayed light. Then Amanda asked if she could show me something. She opened a folder on her tablet and smiled. I have been collecting ideas. Before I could respond, photographs appeared on the screen. Renovated kitchens. Expanded dining rooms. Modern fireplaces. New landscaping designs. Amanda swiped through image after image with growing enthusiasm. Can you imagine how beautiful this place could look? She asked. I looked at the screen. Then I looked at her. That would be a lot of work. She nodded immediately. It would be worth it in the long run. Long run. Future plans. Renovations. The same themes appeared again and again. Michael sat quietly beside her. He seemed uncomfortable, but he never interrupted. As Amanda continued describing changes she wanted to make, a strange realization settled over me. She was not discussing ideas. She was presenting expectations. The conversation finally ended when the children came downstairs asking for snacks. Amanda closed the tablet and moved on as though nothing unusual had happened. But for me, something had changed. Later that evening, after everyone left, I walked through the house room by room. The living room where Margaret spent countless evenings reading. The dining room where we celebrated anniversaries. The kitchen we remodeled together after saving for nearly 3 years. Every space represented decades of effort and sacrifice. Yet somehow Amanda spoke about changing it all with the confidence of an owner. Around 10 o'clock, I returned to my desk and opened the filing cabinet again. This time I was not looking for memories. I was looking for answers. Property records. Legal documents. Ownership information. If Amanda was building plans around this house. The next morning, I carried several folders from the filing cabinet to the dining room table and spread them out beneath the light fixture Margaret had chosen nearly 30 years ago. If someone had told me a month earlier that I would spend my retirement studying property records, I would have laughed. Yet there I sat with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me, searching for answers hidden in paperwork. At first, the documents seemed ordinary. Mortgage records, insurance renewals, tax statements, home improvement permits, decades of responsible ownership neatly organized in folders. Margaret always believed important papers should be easy to find. Looking through them felt like hearing her voice again. Then I located the original closing documents. The pages were slightly worn from age, but everything remained perfectly preserved. I read through each page carefully. Names, Dates, legal descriptions, signatures. Nothing surprising. Still, I continued digging. By midday, I found myself reviewing documents I had not touched in years. Some related to refinancing after Michael left for college. Others documented renovations Margaret and I completed together. Every record told part of the story of how this house became our home. The deeper I looked, the more one question bothered me. Why was Amanda so certain about the future of this property? Confidence like hers usually comes from information. Either she knew something I did not know, or she believed something that was not true. A few days later, I received another clue. Michael called on a Wednesday evening. We spoke about ordinary things for several minutes before he casually mentioned that Amanda had been meeting with a designer she knew through work. A designer? I asked. For what? Michael hesitated. Just ideas. Nothing serious. I remained silent. Eventually, he continued. She likes planning ahead. There was that phrase again. Planning ahead. It seemed to appear everywhere lately. After the call ended, I walked through the house. The living room. The staircase. The guest rooms. Everywhere I looked, I imagined the changes Amanda had described. New walls. New floors. Different layouts. A completely different house. What unsettled me was not the idea of renovations. Homes change. Families evolve. What unsettled me was that nobody had ever asked what I wanted. Every conversation assumed the future belonged to someone else. 2 days later, my sister Sarah stopped by again. We sat at the kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the windows. After listening to everything I had discovered, she leaned back and folded her arms. Richard, let me ask you something. All right. Have you ever actually discussed ownership with Michael or Amanda? The question caught me off guard. No. Why would I? Sarah shrugged. Because people sometimes create stories in their own minds. Her words stayed with me after she left. That evening, I returned to the property documents one final time. This time I focused on the ownership records themselves, not memories, not history, facts. As I carefully reviewed the paperwork, a realization began forming. Amanda had been speaking as though future ownership was already settled. Yet I could not remember a single conversation where anyone had actually confirmed that assumption. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. By the time I closed the final folder, I knew on. The following Monday, I called James Walker. James had been my attorney for nearly 20 years. He handled estate planning after Margaret passed away and helped me update several legal documents over the years. More importantly, he was someone I trusted to tell me the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. His office sat in a brick building downtown, just off the courthouse square. On Wednesday morning, I gathered the property records and drove there. The sky was gray, and winter clouds hung low over the city. By the time I arrived, I had rehearsed a dozen explanations for why I wanted him to review paperwork that seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet when I sat down across from him, I simply told him the truth. Something feels off, I said. James nodded. Then let us start with the facts. For the next hour, we reviewed documents together. Property records, ownership history, estate paperwork, tax filings. James moved through everything carefully, making notes occasionally while I explained recent conversations with Amanda and Michael. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Richard, he said, before we discuss assumptions, let us discuss ownership. My stomach tightened slightly. James turned one of the documents toward me and pointed at a section near the bottom. The ownership structure is very straightforward. I looked down at the page. The words seemed almost too simple after weeks of uncertainty. James continued. After Margaret passed away, the property transferred entirely to you according to the estate documents. He tapped the paper lightly. The current deed lists one owner. I already knew the answer, yet hearing it spoken aloud felt different. More final, more real. And that owner is me, I said. James nodded. Correct. He flipped through several additional pages. Michael is not on the deed. Another page. Amanda is not on the deed. Another page. There are no shared ownership provisions. No transfer agreements. No recorded interests belonging to anyone else. I stared at the paperwork for several seconds. Not because the information surprised me, because it confirmed something important. Every assumption Amanda appeared to be making existed only in her mind. Legally speaking, nothing had changed. James studied my expression. What exactly does Amanda believe? He asked. I thought about the conversations, the renovation plans, the casual references to future ownership, the certainty in her voice whenever she discussed the house. I think she believes this property is already part of her future, I said quietly. James gave a small nod. That happens more often than you would think. He closed the folder. People sometimes confuse expectations with rights. The sentence stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Expectations with rights. During the drive home, I replayed it again and again. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the confusion that had followed me since Thanksgiving was beginning to disappear. The legal reality was simple. The emotional reality was more complicated. Amanda was not treating me like a burden because of my age. She was treating me like an obstacle standing between her and something she believed would eventually belong to her. That realization changed everything. Later that evening, I sat alone in the living room as snow began falling outside. The house felt peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I felt peaceful too. But peace did not erase the larger question. If Amanda had built her assumptions on something that was never true, what would happen when she finally learned the truth? For the next several days, I did not mention the attorney meeting to anyone. Not to Michael. Not to Amanda. Not even to Sarah. I simply lived my life and paid attention. Sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is stop talking and start observing. Once I did, patterns appeared everywhere. Amanda continued speaking about the house as though its future had already been decided. During one phone call, she mentioned expanding the back patio. During another, she talked about converting the upstairs guest room into a home office. Every idea came packaged as a certainty rather than a possibility. What struck me most was that she never once asked what I wanted. It was as if my preferences no longer mattered because she had already written the ending in her mind. The following weekend, Michael invited me to dinner at their house. I accepted. Part of me hoped a normal evening might ease the tension that had quietly grown between us. When I arrived, the grandchildren greeted me at the door. Their excitement immediately lifted my spirits. Children have a way of cutting through complications adults create. For the first hour, everything felt pleasant. We shared a meal. The children talked about school. Michael discussed work. Then the conversation shifted toward real estate. Amanda had been browsing property listings online and began talking about rising home values in the area. This neighborhood has become incredibly desirable, she said. Properties like yours are worth much more than people realize. I nodded politely. Amanda continued. Honestly, it would be smart to start thinking long-term. There was that phrase again. Long-term. I glanced at Michael. He seemed uncomfortable but remained silent. Amanda took a sip of water before adding something that immediately caught my attention. Waiting too long can create complications for everyone. Complications. The word hung in the air. I kept my expression neutral. What kind of complications? I asked. Amanda shrugged. Family transitions. Ownership issues. Future planning. The confidence in her voice was remarkable. She spoke like someone discussing facts rather than assumptions. Suddenly, I realized something important. Amanda was not pretending. She genuinely believed her version of the future was inevitable. That made the situation more troubling and more understandable at the same time. After dinner, while the grandchildren watched a movie upstairs, I stepped outside onto the back porch with Michael. Cold winter air filled the night. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then I asked him a simple question. Do you think I am becoming a burden? Michael looked genuinely surprised. No, Dad. Then why did you stay silent at Thanksgiving? The question seemed to hit him harder than I expected. He stared into the darkness beyond the yard. I should have said something, he admitted quietly. I know that now. Hearing those words brought me no satisfaction. Only sadness. Because deep down, I already knew he regretted it. The real issue was larger than one comment. It was about respect. Before I left that evening, Amanda walked me to the front door. As she opened it, she smiled and said something that confirmed every suspicion I had been carrying. The kids really love spending time here. Someday it will be nice knowing the house stays in the family. I smiled politely and wished everyone good night. But during the drive home, I could think about only one thing. Amanda was not guessing anymore. She was operating from complete certainty. And very soon, that certainty was going to collide with reality. Over the next 2 weeks, I made no effort to correct Amanda's assumptions. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply wanted to understand how far those assumptions had gone. The answer arrived sooner than expected. One Sunday afternoon, Michael called and asked whether I would host a family dinner the following weekend. I agreed immediately. Family dinners had always been important to me. They were one of the few traditions Margaret and I managed to maintain through every stage of life. As the day approached, I found myself strangely calm. The hurt from Thanksgiving remained, but it no longer controlled my thinking. James had given me clarity. The documents had given me certainty. What remained was a conversation that needed to happen. The following Saturday, the house filled once again with familiar voices. My daughter arrived with her family. Sarah came carrying a homemade pie. Michael and Amanda arrived shortly afterward with the children. For the first hour, everything felt normal. Laughter drifted through the kitchen. The grandchildren played board games in the living room. If someone had walked through the front door, they would have seen a happy family gathering. Then, after dinner, the conversation turned exactly where I suspected it might. Sarah mentioned a local construction project she had seen in town. Amanda immediately became enthusiastic. Within minutes, she was talking about renovation ideas again. New flooring, expanded storage, updated landscaping. This time she was even more specific than before. The first thing I would do is open up the wall between the dining room and family room, she said confidently. Several people glanced toward me. Amanda either did not notice or did not care. She continued describing improvements as though presenting plans at a business meeting. Eventually, my daughter asked the obvious question. Have you discussed any of this with Dad? Amanda smiled. Not formally. Then she laughed lightly. There is plenty of time for that. The room grew slightly quieter. I looked at Michael. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but said nothing. Once again, silence seemed easier for him than honesty. Amanda continued. The important thing is keeping the property in the family and making it work for the next generation. Property. Next generation. The same language appeared every time. Suddenly, I realized something. Amanda genuinely believed everyone shared her understanding of the future. She was not hiding her assumptions anymore, because she no longer viewed them as assumptions. To her, they were facts. After dessert, while the children watched a movie upstairs, the adults remained at the table. The conversation slowed. Coffee cups replaced dinner plates. Outside, snow drifted gently beneath the porch light. It felt like the right moment. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply necessary. I stood and walked toward the study. A few moments later, I returned carrying a slim folder. Nobody paid much attention at first. I placed it on the table beside my coffee and resumed listening. Eventually, Amanda mentioned ownership again while discussing long-term plans. This time I spoke. Amanda, I said calmly. The room became quiet. Before anyone makes plans for this house, there is something important we should probably discuss. Every face turned toward me. Amanda smiled politely. Of course. I rested my hand on the folder. Years of assumptions seemed to sit inside those few sheets of paper. Then I looked directly at Michael and Amanda. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I was no longer interested in avoiding discomfort, because I had finally realized something important. The real betrayal was never the insult. The real betrayal was believing I had become invisible inside my own home. The room remained silent after I spoke. Snow continued drifting outside the windows while everyone at the table waited for me to continue. Amanda still wore the same confident expression she had carried for months, but I noticed something else now. Curiosity, perhaps even concern. Slowly, I opened the folder and removed several documents. Then I placed them on the table between us. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Amanda glanced down at the papers. What is this? She asked. Property records, I replied calmly. Michael shifted in his chair. Sarah remained perfectly still. My daughter looked back and forth between me and the documents. Amanda gave a small laugh. Okay. She clearly did not understand where the conversation was heading. I folded my hands. For several months, I have listened to discussions about renovations, ownership, future plans, and what should happen to this house. Amanda's smile faded slightly. We were only talking about possibilities. I nodded. Perhaps. But those possibilities seemed unusually specific. Nobody interrupted. I continued. After Thanksgiving, I reviewed the property records and met with my attorney. At the mention of the attorney, Michael looked up immediately. Amanda's expression tightened. I pulled one document from the folder and turned it toward them. This is the current deed. The room became completely silent. Even the ticking clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual. Amanda looked down at the page. Michael leaned forward. For several seconds, neither of them said anything. Then Amanda frowned slightly. I do not understand. I pointed to the ownership section. The property belongs to one person. Her eyes moved across the document. I watched the moment realization began to appear. Not all at once. Slowly, piece by piece. Michael read the page again, then a third time. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. Amanda looked at me. Your name is the only name here. Yes, I said. It is. Nobody spoke for several moments. The confidence that had accompanied every conversation about the house suddenly disappeared. Not because I had embarrassed anyone. Not because I had won an argument. Because reality had finally entered the room. Amanda stared at the papers. I thought. She stopped speaking. Then she tried again. I assumed. The sentence never finished. Assumed. That was exactly the problem. So many decisions had been built on assumptions. So many opinions had been expressed without understanding the facts. I looked directly at her. Amanda, this conversation is not really about the deed. She met my eyes. It is not. I shook my head. No, it is about respect. The room remained quiet. On Thanksgiving, you called me a burden. Since then, I have listened to conversations about my home as though I no longer mattered. Not one person asked what I wanted. Not one person asked how I felt. Michael lowered his head. Amanda looked genuinely uncomfortable. For the first time since all of this began, I believed she understood the impact of her words. Eventually she spoke. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. I am sorry, Richard. Nobody rushed to fill the silence afterward. The apologies simply remained there. Honest. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Over the following months, things gradually changed. Not overnight. Real change rarely happens that way. Amanda stopped talking about the house as though it belonged to her. Michael became more willing to speak up when conversations crossed boundaries. Most importantly, I stopped shrinking myself to keep everyone else comfortable. One spring afternoon, I sat beneath the maple tree Margaret and I planted decades earlier. My grandchildren were playing in the yard while family gathered nearby. The house was still standing exactly where it always had. But something inside me had changed. I finally understood that growing older does not make a person less valuable. Needing respect is not selfish. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is remind people that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Because the day someone called me a burden was the day I remembered exactly who I was.